Fish proteins should collapse under the pressure found deep inside the Mariana Trench. Scientists had already calculated the exact depth where that collapse becomes unavoidable. A team lowered a simple baited camera rig anyway, built for hours of waiting rather than any real expectation. Something swam into frame at almost the precise depth their own math said was the limit. The depth nobody was supposed to reach. In May 2017, a research vessel called the Kairei, operated by the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology, lowered a piece of equipment called a lander into the Mariana Trench. A lander is a heavy, pressure-proof frame built to sink straight to the bottom of the ocean on its own, carrying cameras, lights, and bait to lure in anything nearby. This particular lander carried a high-resolution camera pointed at a patch of mackerel bait, sitting at a depth of 8,178 meters below the surface, deep inside the Western Pacific's most famous and least explored trench. What swam past that camera became the deepest fish ever filmed at the time, a pale, almost translucent creature with no scales and a soft tadpole-shaped body. Researchers had already given this species a name a few years earlier, Pseudoleparus suirae, more commonly called the Mariana snailfish, named directly after the trench where it was first properly studied. The footage confirmed something researchers had suspected, but never actually filmed alive at that exact depth inside this specific trench, that a real, living, breathing vertebrate could survive in a place most people assume should crush anything with bones almost instantly. That single piece of footage did more than break a depth record. It landed almost exactly on top of a number scientists had already calculated years earlier using pure chemistry, a theoretical limit. Nobody expected to see tested this precisely inside the very trench that gave the ocean its name for extreme depth. Understanding why that number even exists means starting with exactly how the Mariana Trench came to be the deepest place on the entire planet. A trench built by a slow collision. The Mariana Trench did not form from any single dramatic event. It is the product of one of the slowest, most patient collisions imaginable, a process geologists call subduction, where one section of the Earth's crust gets forced beneath another. In this specific location, the Pacific Plate, older, colder, and denser than its neighbor, is being pushed down beneath the smaller Mariana Plate at a rate of roughly 6 centimeters a year, about the speed a fingernail grows. That process has been running continuously for more than 50 million years, and the trench itself is essentially the crease left behind where the two plates meet and one dives underneath the other. This exact stretch of ocean sits inside a larger system geologists call the Izu-Bonin Mariana Subduction Zone, which stretches north from Guam all the way up toward Japan. As the Pacific Plate sinks deeper into the Earth's mantle, the melting rock it generates rises back up to the surface further inland, which is exactly what built the volcanic islands of the Mariana Chain sitting just west of the trench itself. Despite producing the deepest known point on the entire planet, the subduction happening underneath the Mariana Trench runs unusually smoothly compared to some other trench systems around the Pacific, since nearby fault lines let the Pacific Plate bend more gradually rather than jamming and grinding against its neighbor. One especially strange side effect of this slow collision involves something called serpentinite mud volcanoes, found scattered across the Forearc region just west of the trench. As the Pacific Plate gets dragged downward, water trapped inside its rock reacts chemically with minerals under intense heat and pressure, producing a soft, mineral-rich mud that eventually forces its way back up through cracks in the seafloor. Researchers studying these mud volcanoes have found they may host microbial communities that survive purely on the chemical energy released by these reactions, a discovery that has drawn serious attention from scientists studying how life itself might have first started on Earth. That detail matters a great deal for the rest of this story, since it shows the Mariana Trench was already supporting strange, chemistry-driven life long before anyone thought to go looking for a fish swimming near its walls. Why anything down there should be impossible. The Mariana Trench stretches more than 2,550 kilometers long in a crescent shape across the western Pacific. Its deepest point, called the Challenger Deep, reaches close to 10,935 meters below the surface, though different survey methods over the decades have produced slightly different numbers, ranging from about 10,900 to just under 11,000 meters. The Mariana snailfish footage was captured a bit higher up the trench wall at 8,178 meters, still deep enough to sit firmly inside what scientists call the hadal zone, the technical name given to any part of the ocean deeper than 6,000 meters. Water pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters a person or object travels downward. By the time you reach 8,178 meters inside the Mariana Trench, the total pressure pushing in from every direction sits at more than 800 times what a person feels standing at sea level. At the true bottom of the trench, that number climbs past 1,000 atmospheres, or somewhere around 15,750 pounds per square inch. A force scientists have compared to the weight of about 50 jumbo jets pressing down on a single point, or an elephant balanced on top of a human thumb. Ordinary soft tissue simply cannot exist under that kind of crushing weight without some kind of biological trick keeping it from collapsing. Sunlight disappears within the first couple hundred meters below the surface, meaning the Mariana snailfish spends its entire life in complete, permanent darkness, in water sitting just above freezing despite the trench resting in a tropical stretch of the Pacific thousands of kilometers from either pole. Food is scarce, arriving only as slow-drifting scraps scientists call marine snow, tiny bits of dead material sinking down from the surface over weeks or months before finally settling near the bottom. Cold, dark, food-starved, and crushed under nearly 1,000 atmospheres of pressure is already a brutal combination for anything with a backbone, and it raises the obvious question researchers spent decades trying to answer inside this exact trench. Exactly how far down can a fish push these limits before its own body simply stops working? The humans who went there first. Long before any camera filmed a living fish at these depths, a small handful of people went down into the Mariana Trench themselves, and their numbers stayed remarkably small for decades. Only 12 people have ever walked on the moon, and 24 total have traveled there, including astronauts who orbited without landing. Meanwhile, researchers tracking crewed descents into the Challenger Deep estimate that at least 27 people, and possibly more than 40, had reached the very bottom of the Mariana Trench by early 2023, a number that quietly overtook the moon's total without most people ever noticing. The first crewed descent happened in January 1960 when Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh piloted a bathyscaphe called the Trieste down to the bottom and stayed there for about 20 minutes. The dive nearly ended in disaster since a viewing window cracked partway down under the strain of the pressure, though the vessel held together long enough to reach bottom and return safely. Piccard later wrote that the trip settled a real scientific question biologists had been debating for years, whether life could exist at all at the deepest point in the ocean, and it could, since the crew reported spotting what looked like a flat fish resting on the seafloor, even at that extreme depth. Nobody returned for over 50 years after that dive, until filmmaker James Cameron piloted a solo submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger down to roughly 10,908 meters in March 2012. After Cameron's dive, the pace picked up dramatically. Between April 2019 and July 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo made 15 separate descents to the Challenger Deep, piloting a submersible called the DS-5 limiting factor, taking along passengers that eventually included former NASA astronaut Kathy Sullivan. making her the first person in history to have both walked in space and visited the deepest point on Earth. China's own crewed submersible, the Fendouzhe, reached the bottom in 2020 as well. Even with that recent burst of activity, a single trip to the Challenger Deep still requires a purpose-built pressure hull and months of preparation, which is part of why studying this trench up close has always depended more on unmanned equipment than human visitors, including the exact kind of camera rig that eventually caught the Mariana snailfish on film. The search that found the fish. Marine biologist Alan Jameson has spent much of his career trying to map exactly how deep life can survive inside trenches like this one, running expeditions into the Mariana Trench using specially built landers designed to survive hadal pressure for hours or days at a time. Jameson and his colleague Thomas Lindley had already collected a live Mariana snailfish specimen in November 2014, filming and recovering one from 7,966 meters inside the trench, a discovery that helped formally establish the species and push the known depth limit for fish deeper than almost anyone expected at the time. The 2017 expedition that captured the record-breaking footage followed the same basic method used throughout Mariana Trench research. A lander gets loaded with bait, usually mackerel, and lowered on a weighted line straight down to the target depth, where it settles onto the trench floor and waits. Cameras attached to the frame stay recording continuously, capturing anything that happens to swim into the light while researchers wait on the surface, sometimes for many hours, before winching the whole rig back up to see what got caught on tape. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. That patient, low-tech method is largely why scientists keep discovering new details about life inside the Mariana Trench, using bait and cameras rather than expensive crude submersibles. It also explains why the Mariana snailfish kept turning up deeper and deeper as researchers kept trying inside this specific trench, each expedition pushing the known limit a little further down the trench wall. What made the 2017 footage especially significant was not just the depth record itself, but exactly how well this particular fish had adapted to survive there at all, and what that survival trick actually looked like up close. Meet the fish that broke the rules. Pseudoleparus suirae looks nothing like the toothy monsters people usually imagine living at extreme ocean depths. It grows to roughly 20 to 30 centimeters long, has no scales, and carries a soft, almost jelly-like body built to work with the surrounding pressure rather than fight against it. A rigid shell or hard bone structure would simply crack under that much force. So evolution took the opposite approach, building a fish soft and flexible enough to let the crushing weight of the Mariana Trench pass through it instead of shattering it. Snailfish as a family are not naturally a deep-sea group. Most species closely related to the Mariana snailfish live in shallow coastal water, estuaries, and tide pools, making its descent into the trench's hadal zone a genuinely unusual evolutionary detour compared to close relatives living just a few hundred meters below the surface anywhere else in the world. Researchers studying the species have noted that despite this soft, fragile-looking body, the fish appears healthy and active at depths that would instantly kill most other vertebrates, swimming and feeding normally rather than struggling to survive against the pressure surrounding it on every side. The Mariana snailfish feeds mainly on small crustaceans called amphipods, tiny shrimp-like scavengers that share the same extreme depths inside the trench and survive on whatever scraps of marine snow eventually reach the bottom. Watching this soft, pale little fish calmly hunting amphipods at nearly 8 kilometers down looks almost mundane on camera, right up until you remember exactly how far past the edge of normal biology this animal is quietly operating and how completely alone it is in that particular corner of the ocean. Making sense of how it manages that trick at all means looking closely at the actual chemistry happening inside its cells. the chemistry keeping it alive. Ordinary proteins, the building blocks that keep every living cell functioning properly, start to bend and unfold under enough physical pressure, a process scientists call denaturation. At depths approaching 8 kilometers inside the Mariana Trench, that kind of pressure should be more than enough to wreck the basic protein structure inside any normal animal cells, which raises the obvious question of how the Mariana snailfish avoids that fate entirely while swimming calmly through water that would instantly destroy most other creatures. The answer involves a compound called trimethylamine oxide, often shortened to TMAO, part of a broader family of chemicals researchers call piezolites. These molecules build up inside the cells of deep-sea fish and work almost like a stabilizing scaffold, keeping proteins properly folded and functional even as outside pressure tries to force them apart at the molecular level. Researchers studying fish collected from various depths inside the Mariana Trench have noticed a consistent pattern. The deeper a fish typically lives, the more TMAO its tissue tends to carry, almost as though there is a built-in dial linking depth directly to how much of this protective chemical a body can produce and hold before something else starts to fail instead. That pattern led researchers, including biochemist Paul Yancey, to ask a much bigger question back in 2014. If TMAO concentration rises predictably with depth, is there a point where a fish's body simply cannot produce enough of it to survive any deeper inside a trench like this one? A hard biological ceiling built directly into basic ocean chemistry, rather than into anything else about the animal's design. Answering that question turned into one of the more remarkable calculations in modern marine biology, and it produced a number that would end up matching real footage from inside the Mariana Trench almost exactly. The wall scientists say nothing can cross. Working from measured TMAO levels across a range of deep-sea fish species, Yancey and his research colleagues calculated a theoretical maximum depth limit for any bony fish on Earth, landing on a range somewhere between 8,200 and 8,400 meters. Past that point, their models suggested a fish's body would need to produce so much TMAO to keep its protein stable that the chemical itself would start disrupting normal cell function in other ways, essentially poisoning the fish with its own survival mechanism before pressure alone ever got the chance to finish the job. That number was published as a scientific prediction, a calculated boundary built entirely from chemistry rather than direct observation, since no confirmed living fish had actually been filmed anywhere near that exact depth inside the Mariana Trench at the time the calculation came out. It sat there as an interesting theoretical claim for a few years, the kind of number researchers cite in papers, without necessarily expecting to see it tested by an actual living animal caught on camera inside the very trench the prediction was built around. Then, in May 2017, the Mariana snailfish showed up swimming calmly at 8,178 meters, sitting almost exactly at the edge of that predicted biochemical wall, inside the exact same trench researchers had studied for years while building the theory in the first place. This was not a coincidence discovered after the fact. The math came first, the theoretical ceiling came first, and only afterward did a real living fish appear on film, sitting right at the boundary scientists had already calculated using pure chemistry years earlier. That close match between prediction and footage remains one of the cleanest confirmations of a theoretical biological limit anywhere in ocean science, and it happened entirely within the walls of one single trench. Other creatures sharing that same impossible zone. Fish are not the only animals pushing right up against the edge of survivable depth inside the Mariana Trench. Sharing roughly that same crushing pressure zone is a creature called Alicella gigantea, nicknamed the supergiant amphipod, a shrimp-like scavenger that dwarfs its ordinary relatives. Typical amphipods rarely grow past a single centimeter, while this species grows past 30 centimeters, 20 to 30 times larger, and has been recorded at depths ranging from around 3,890 meters all the way down to nearly 8,931 meters inside trenches, including the Mariana, deeper than any fish has ever managed to survive in that same environment. Genetic studies of this supergiant amphipod suggest a single connected population may stretch across more than half the world's oceans, showing up in trenches thousands of kilometers apart while carrying nearly identical DNA. Scientists still debate exactly why this species grows so disproportionately large compared to its relatives, though leading theories point toward a pattern called deep-sea gigantism, where crushing cold and pressure inside places like the Mariana Trench may slow metabolism enough to let cells grow bigger and animals live considerably longer than their shallow water cousins. Even stranger still are xenophyophores, single-celled organisms roughly the size of a mango that hold the record for the largest known single cell in all of science. A 2011 Scripps Institution of Oceanography expedition documented these giant cells living at depths up to 10,641 meters deep inside the Mariana Trench's own Serena Deep, breaking the previous depth record for the species by nearly 2 miles in a single discovery made inside this exact trench. These giant cells act almost like tiny apartment buildings, hosting smaller organisms inside their structure, and researchers have found they concentrate heavy metals like lead, uranium, and mercury from the surrounding water at unusually high levels, a detail that connects directly to something far less reassuring. Researchers found, sitting alongside the fish and amphipods in the very same trench. The disturbing discovery, sitting next to the fish space, for all its emptiness and cold, is essentially untouched by human waste, since nothing thrown away on Earth has drifted up and settled onto the Moon or Mars in any meaningful amount. The Mariana Trench cannot say the same thing, and that difference turns out to matter directly for understanding the same animals living alongside the record-breaking snailfish. In 2017, a research team led by Alan Jameson at Newcastle University published a study in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, examining small shrimp-like scavengers called amphipods, pulled up from both the Mariana and Kermadec trenches, using specially built deep-sea landers, the same basic equipment used to film the snailfish. What they found inside the fatty tissue of these creatures were extraordinarily high levels of persistent organic pollutants, specifically polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs, and polybrominated diphenyl ethers, used for decades as electrical insulators and flame retardants. PCBs were banned worldwide starting in the late 1970s due to links with cancer, yet the most contaminated amphipod samples pulled from the Mariana Trench carried PCB levels roughly 50 times higher than crabs studied in one of the most polluted rivers in China. Jameson said publicly that his team had always assumed the deep ocean was remote and pristine, safe from human impact, and that the results showed that assumption could not be further from the truth. The amphipod species involved in that particular study, called Hirondelia gigas, survives by scavenging almost any organic material that sinks down from the surface, meaning it eats whatever drifts down through 11 kilometers of open water inside the Mariana Trench, pollutants included. Once a chemical like this settles into trench sediment at that depth, there is nowhere left for it to go, so it simply accumulates, decade after decade, in one of the only places on the planet nobody visits often enough to clean it up. Explorer Victor Vescovo has personally reported seeing plastic bags and candy wrappers resting on the trench floor during his own dives, meaning the same water column supporting a record-breaking, biochemically perfected snailfish is also quietly serving as humanity's deepest, most permanent trash can. The part that makes this stranger than any myth. Old stories about sea monsters lurking in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean almost always describe something enormous, a kraken large enough to drag down a ship, or some ancient beast built to dominate the abyss through raw size and strength. Real research inside the Mariana Trench keeps turning up the exact opposite pattern. Giant squid only live down to about 1,000 meters. Even sperm whales, the deepest diving mammal on Earth, rarely push much past 2,000 meters on their most extreme feeding dives, barely a fifth of the way down to where the Mariana snailfish was actually filmed swimming calmly through the trench. The genuinely strange residents of the true hadal zone inside this trench are almost never large or fearsome. They are small, soft-bodied, and built entirely around chemistry rather than size, animals that survive by managing pressure at the molecular level instead of overpowering it through brute strength. A pale, thumb-sized fish with no scales pushing right up against a scientifically calculated biochemical wall inside the same trench that also holds the world's largest single cell, a supergiant scavenging shrimp, and decades of banned industrial chemicals is a far stranger and more genuinely surprising discovery than any imagined monster could ever be, precisely because none of it required inventing anything at all. That is really the core twist buried inside this entire story. Nature did not need a myth or a monster to produce something that looks almost impossible on paper. It just needed one small, unglamorous fish quietly solving a chemistry problem inside one specific trench, a problem scientists had already mapped out years before anyone managed to film the proof, swimming past a camera at the exact depth their math predicted. What actually explains the sighting? None of this means science has fully run out of mysteries inside the Mariana Trench. Researchers are still working out exactly why TMAO levels rise the way they do, exactly how the trench's slow geological formation continues shaping the chemistry supporting life at these depths, and whether some future expedition might eventually find a fish species inside this same trench capable of nudging the known limit even a little further than 8,178 meters. The underlying biochemistry genuinely does appear to run out of room right around this exact zone, based on every measurement collected from the trench so far. What the science does not support is any kind of supernatural or unexplainable creature lurking inside these depths. Every recorded sighting inside the Mariana Trench traces back to real, documented chemistry, real expeditions using real equipment, and real published research, explaining exactly why these animals can survive where they do, and why they almost certainly cannot survive much deeper than that inside this specific trench. The genuine mystery here was never about monsters. It was always about exactly how far ordinary biology could be stretched before it finally broke. And the Mariana snailfish turned out to be nature's most precise answer to that question anywhere on the planet. Verdict. Here is where things actually stand. In May 2017, researchers with the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology filmed a Mariana snailfish, Pseudoleparus swirri, swimming at 8,178 meters inside the Mariana Trench, close enough to 27,000 feet to explain the popular framing of this story, and deep enough to sit right at the edge of a biochemical depth limit scientists had already calculated years earlier using measurements of a stabilizing compound called TMAO. That predicted limit, worked out by biochemist Paul Yancey and colleagues in 1914, placed the maximum depth any bony fish could survive somewhere between 8,200 and 8,400 meters, based purely on how much of this protective chemical a fish's cells could hold before it started causing more harm than the crushing pressure itself. That same trench also holds the world's largest known single cell, a supergiant scavenging amphipod stretched across half the planet's oceans, and decades of banned industrial pollution that reached the seafloor long before most scientists thought to check for it there. Nothing filmed inside the Mariana Trench turned out to be some undiscovered monster or unexplainable creature. What actually showed up was a small, soft-bodied fish, quietly living right at the edge of a wall built out of pure biochemistry, proof that the real limits of life in the deepest place on Earth are stranger, more precise, and more genuinely remarkable than anything a sea monster story could have invented on its own. If this kind of deep ocean mystery is your thing, subscribing helps more of these stories reach you the moment they come out.